Welcome to Gaming the Podcast. On this week's episode, we are going to be discussing what it is that we believe makes a great RPG. I'm John Robertson, and I'm joined as ever by Stace Harman. And so, Stace, I'll give you the difficult task of going first. What do you think makes a great RPG? If you can sum it up in 10 seconds or less, and then we can bite-size it on Twitter, and then we've answered the question.
Podcasting for the Instagram generation. Okay, so I'm going to start with something that I think applies to certainly every RPG that I have loved, and I can certainly see where I fall off RPGs that don't have this. And it's an important or a sense. Well, it's a sense of place, a sense of a thing that exists, a place that exists, and how that then makes me feel, which we'll sort of get onto later. But so there's lots of RPGs that I've played over the years that I thought one of the things that was going to be important was good writing, and I thought about what that meant and do I believe in the place that I'm in. But I kind of, when I boiled it down, I sort of realised that actually it's more of a feeling that I get when I walk around a world or a specific place in a game. And how does it make me feel? It always kind of comes back to that for me. So, so some examples of that would be like pretty much, well, certainly the latest two Elder Scrolls games. So Oblivion and Skyrim. I mean, it's obviously a very oft repeated and oft referred to example, Skyrim specifically. But that has this sense of place that I'm talking about. The world of The Witcher, some very specific locations in like Zelda, not Hyrule as an overarching like world, but just each Zelda map has its own sort of before Breath of the Wild particularly. Each of those like 2D top down look at it maps has this kind of sense of place. And these are things that all tie into, like, when I think back on these RPGs, I think of the place and the kind of the exploration of that place. And that's one of the biggest, if not the biggest, but certainly one of the biggest things for me that's important for any great RPG is this sense of place. And I know that we talked prior, and you have a similar. You came at arrived at the same conclusion, but from a slightly different direction, right?
Yeah, so I labelled it depth of worlds, and I think as being something important to make an RPG great. And I think I define it by a sense of the world being having this feeling that it's alive, that it's real, that it's existed before you arrived. And sort of jumping the gun a bit, and that you play a character that can meaningfully kind of interject itself in this world and play a role in this world, and the world kind of reacts to you. Not necessarily in the sense that like it changes necessarily, but in the sense that it just notices you, right? It accepts that your involvement here is part of it now, and it shows that in some way. So I'm thinking Zelda Breath of the Wild for me certainly plays into that. It's quite a sparsely populated world, but there's enough hints that like things happened here, and it's sort of almost post-apocalyptic in a way, isn't it? Breath of the Wild as well. But it feels like it used to be more there than there was now. So I guess even thinking about it, it doesn't have to be that there doesn't have to be loads in the world, because Breath of the Wild has less in it than it could, but it sort of hints that there were bigger things, or there are things, there's a history that happened to have arrived at this place. Final Fantasy VII's Midgar, the Kamurocho district in Yakuza, which is based on Shinjuku. Then I'm trying to think of other ones. Fort Joy in Divinity 2. Every town.
The World Ends With You, actually, or Neo specifically, the latest World Ends With You has got that definitely as well for me, a sense of place. And that's a very specific. I've been to this place, and because it's modelled on Shibuya, and I've been in Japan, and I've been in Tokyo specifically, and I've been to that place, and it's not that I recognise that shop or I recognise that street. It's that it feels like that place, and it does a very good job of recreating that, even if you don't you can only interact with a handful of shops. You only go into a handful of places. The people walking around you don't interact with in any meaningful way, really. But yeah, that place, and I also I see it in games of D&D where it's like it's a believability thing for me. I think it's like, do I believe in this world? Because I want to. Like, you know, if you're playing D&D or if you're playing a role-playing game, you want to believe in that world. That's partly why you're doing it. You're willing to suspend your disbelief. And then things that reinforce that and back that up just feel good. They like, it's a validation, I suppose. But like going into a little village, and this can be in a video game RPG or in D&D, and then like wanting to go to the magic shop to buy some potions, and then in the case of D&D, the DM saying, well, no, there is no magic shop here. You're in the middle of nowhere. Like, what are you talking about? It's like that. Yeah, of course. Like, is that moment where it's like, oh, okay, yeah, I'm, you know, this is a world that exists, not a place that just is here for me to come and restock my inventory. Yeah. And that I like that. Even though I'm sort of being told I can't do something, it's like I really like the reason for it, and therefore it makes me buy into it all the more and feel
boundaries
better about it.
Yeah, boundaries make something feel more real. Don't it? If something's just boundaryless, then it's kind of, well, it feels fake because it's not what we're used to in our own perception of reality. Like, so that's why it's difficult to envision a constantly expanding universe. Or what's it expanding into? Like, there's got to be a barrier there somewhere. But like, I was thinking when you're talking now, I wonder if sense of place, what depth of world building, whatever you want to call it, is such a key element to what makes a great RPG, that actually when the world does have all of these things that we've spoken about, this depth and this believability and this reactionary state, I wonder if that's enough to make a game an RPG in and of itself. Because when you're talking, I'm thinking about BioShock, and the world building in BioShock is incredible, and it feels like it's a real place and it's memorable when you're moving through it. BioShock does have other RPG elements as well. You're gaining tools and leveling up your skills and whatever. But I wonder if that in and of itself is enough to make BioShock more of an RPG than it is a shooter.
Very possibly, perhaps more so, because when you think of BioShock and you think of the RPG elements as they are usually described, it is those skill trees and the currency and the plasmids and you make a choice, or famously in the first one, you know, you're not making any real choice, but you're making a choice and things are reacting to you. Those are the things that tend to be held up. But actually, the sense of place for you to play that role in, whether that's under your own volition or because you're being forced to, that does, and I get the same sort of feelings playing BioShock as I do, and more specifically the first two than Infinite, I would say, because the sense of place for me was not as strong in Infinite. But that's a very an interesting point, and it also leads to that sense of place, depth of world, leads to another big thing for me, which is like the way that an RPG makes me feel. It's a very experiential thing. I mean, you know, that's probably an obvious thing to say, but it's a very, like, how I feel when I'm playing an RPG particularly is what will take me back to RPGs years later, whereas I might not replay a different type of game, or it will be what prompts me to put on an RPG playlist on, you know, YouTube Music or something. Like, it's to sort of recreate that feeling of that I had playing that game, and because the soundtracks tend to be pretty epic, because they're designed to be played for dozens, if not 100+ hours. The soundtracks tend to be very nuanced and very well put together. So they're enjoyable to listen to anyway. But so all of that feeds in again to like how I feel playing these games, and it's why I can identify certain games. So like the Zelda series, pre Breath of the Wild, I would say. There's certain entries in that series that I really, really like, and then there's ones that I just bounce off. And I think most of it is because it depends on what mood I'm in when I play them, because a lot of them feel a bit like clockwork toys. Immaculately designed clockwork toys, and they work incredibly well. They don't really make me feel very much. I don't feel very much for the characters. You know, it's kind of like it's kind of like, it's like Mario template.
Well,
drafted
they're
onto an
secondary,
RPG,
aren't they, to the mechanics?
Here's a hero, an antagonist,
and it's the same.
princess.
Yeah, it's the same vague story every single time. Rescue this person. Here's the great evil of the world that's reborn and whatever. Then the story in that's very much a slave. It's very much designed not to get in the way of the real attempt at gaining your concentration, which is mastering the mechanics and understanding how to progress. And
so sometimes I can really enjoy that, and sometimes I'm just like, it's just not really. I can't know for sure that I'm going to go into that, and I have to decide when I'm going to pick up a Zelda game, I think, is what I'm getting at. Whereas a lot of the RPGs that I love, I'll start playing and it will just, that will then be that's what I'm playing then. That it's kind of, it's the decision's been made for me almost. So the experiential side of it is definitely a big thing for me, how it makes me feel, how it achieves that often through music. And I think there's, to loop back to like the depth of world thing, that's one of the things that I really enjoy doing, is exploring the map, going to a place, looking at a place on the map and then going there. Not because, if you go to a far-flung place on a video game map, you're probably going to get some sort of cool reward. Not for that reason, although I accept that that's probably going to happen. But like, I enjoy going to a place and just seeing, is there some small hut there that, on the edge of a lake that's abandoned, that kind of tells its own story.
That's what you were specifically looking for when you went to that part of the map. Is there a small
And if
hut?
there isn't, I'm very disappointed.
No small hut, 7 out of 10.
Or is there indeed, like, just nothing there, which kind of for me tells its own story. It's like, well, then I'm just stood on the edge of the world. I'm stood on the edge of the world, and there's nothing here. This place hasn't been populated, and so that imbues both some sort of particular feeling and ties into the whole sense of place, depth of world thing as well.
Yeah, well, I think when you was talking about going to this place and seeing what was there, I did that a lot in Fallout 3. I don't really like Fallout 4 that much, but Fallout 3 I did that a lot, and Fallout 3 was very good at that, and it was often a kind of maze, a puzzle in order to work out how you got to that place as well, which kind of made the world feel more real in that it's this post-apocalyptic nuclear disaster zone. So just getting there isn't just a case of walking from A to B and just making sure you got enough food and time. It's also about working out how to get there, which does make the worlds, give that feeling of depth to the world, that it's a character in its own right.
Yeah.
But it's also, I think, that ability to choose where you want to go and where. Obviously, this applies to open world RPGs, and there's many different kinds of RPGs, but certainly for those sort of open world RPGs, that form of choice is surely like a key pillar. Because I was thinking about this choice and like how important is choice in general to me in RPGs, and not necessarily like geographical choice. Although I do think that's important, and that can give you a wildly different perspective of the world, the order in which you see things, a wildly different perspective to other people that have played the same things in a different order. But also in terms of, I think, the more common way of looking at choice in game, which is in RPGs, which is, this choice and consequences. Do you want to do the good thing or the bad thing? Or do you want to do nothing? Or here's 5 different shades of grey in between? Or here's, some random quirky thing that you might choose to do or whatever. And I was thinking like, that is really important to me. And I'm thinking about things I've played recently, like Divinity and Baldur's Gate. And The Witcher longer ago. I've just started playing Pathfinder as well, Wrath of the Righteous, the new Pathfinder game that came out last week. And that's just like Baldur's Gate and Divinity, like incredibly choice heavy, like 6-7 dialogue options for every conversation, for every line of conversation, like, talk to this person, don't talk to that person, kill this one, don't, like, whatever. And I was thinking, yes, that is really important. And it certainly is important in those games. So consequences for your actions, or consequences for your choices / actions, as being a really important thing for me. But then some of my favourite RPGs, the Yakuza games, Final Fantasy 7, Final Fantasy 7, 8, and 9 in particular, of the Final Fantasy games, they don't really provide that much choice of narrative. They provide choice elsewhere, which we can talk about, but they don't provide much choice of action, of narrative or narrative actions at all, really. And yet I still really love those games, even though they don't have this thing that I do love in these other games. So when trying to come up with what makes a great RPG, some of these things that make this RPG great, and it's like, okay, well, that's what makes it great. That's what makes the genre great. Well, it doesn't even exist in this other one that I think makes it great. And then thinking about that, I wonder if it's more important to me that I don't really care if I'm in control of the narrative at all. I just want the narrative to have consequences for the characters involved. So in Final Fantasy, I'm not making any choices. In most Final Fantasies, I'm not making any choices that inform the next cutscene. But the character on screen made a choice, and that does have a consequence in the next cutscene. So maybe that's just enough. So maybe in the narrative, for me, it just has to have actions and consequences, whether or not I am a part of the choice of the action. I wonder if that's not a key thing. It just is a key thing of a certain kind of RPG, but it's not a rule that needs to be universally blanketly applied to all of them.
No, I can see. Yeah, I can definitely appreciate that and identify with that. I think and that's why I thought good writing was going to be a thing for me. I thought when I sat down to make this list, I thought, I almost started with that. Well, of course it's got to be well written. And I was thinking about specific games.
You mentioned Skyrim at the start, which is all choice and consequence. So that's all absolutely. That game is.
Yeah,
that's
and that is
a horrible way of, but that's a big thing of what that game is.
I know what you mean. It's got some. It's got lots and lots of qualities. It's also got some sort of hokey writing, but that kind of like fairy tale sort of like, there's a giant in the hills and that sort of stuff. And in that kind of game, it's like, all I need to know is where I need to go. I just need to hear some sort of rumor of, I don't need to stand there and talk through this area's backstory or the lore of this area or this, that. I'm not really bothered about that because the writing, doesn't electrify me. And I'm like, just tell me where I need to go, or better still, tell me that there are these 3, 4, 5 places in the local area that have stuff attached to them. And I'll go and explore and just find out. I don't need to stand here. I'd spend very little time in towns and villages and cities in Skyrim or Oblivion, outside of like proper quest points. But even that, I've played those games for I don't know exactly, but scores of hours, probably, Oblivion and Skyrim, I don't know, 100+ hours total. I've not been anywhere near completing the main quest lines. I'm not even sure I could tell you what you're meant to be doing, really. Oblivion Gates, I remember that from Oblivion. But I just explore a load. And so the writing isn't as big a deal as I thought it was going to be, and I think it's not always the one thing that you think, every game I love has this particular thing. It doesn't necessarily, but there's definitely common themes that run through several of the things that I like. Like you mentioned Final Fantasy, and that's why I kind of prefer Final Fantasy over Dragon Quest as a general series, because Final Fantasy ticks some of these boxes more or delivers better in some of these areas than Dragon Quest does for me. But it's a lot of the Final Fantasy games don't make me feel stuff. Like, I appreciate them. Like, I enjoy the intellectual exercise of setting up the gambit system in Final Fantasy 12 and enjoy that challenge and that stimulation, and like it's a puzzle, and enjoy feeling clever, essentially. Like, I've set this up but if this kicks in, that's okay because I've got these other characters doing this other thing. But that doesn't, I can appreciate that as a well-designed system, but it doesn't make me like, it's not the thing that I'm after. It's not the feeling. It's not that kind of experiential experience that I'm looking for when I'm playing an RPG.
I think Final Fantasy 12 is an interesting one, the one with the gambit system that you mentioned, and it's the one that I really like and I've played a lot of, and intellectually it's rewarding in that way, but it is the one I'm kind of least passionate about, not the least passionate about, but I'm way less passionate about that than I am some of the earlier games and the Final Fantasy 7 remake, because the characterization is just not there. Like, the game is more about just giving you loads of stuff to do and loads of places to go and loads of like locations to wander around and kill monsters in and stuff. And the cities are impressive in their scale, and there's people walking around, although they're quite hollow because you can't, there's each character in there, most of the NPCs walking around that has 5 words to say and then they just repeat them. But yeah, on an intellectual level, the Gambit system's really interesting, but the characters are just nowhere near as good. Like, so it doesn't, as much as I want to be grounded in the world, I need to be grounded in the world through characters, maybe. And those characters in Final Fantasy XII are just nowhere near as interesting. They're not as, I don't know, they're not as deep. Like, the things just don't seem as important to them as they do in, say, as the things do in Final Fantasy VII. And the inter-character relationships between them are not as strong. So I was thinking about, so like what you were saying about the intellectual exercise. And I think one of the key things, more than having agency over the story for me, is agency in being able to define what your characters do in non-story mode when they're exploring or when they're fighting or whatever. So agency in leveling up, I guess. Agency in deciding mechanically who these people are. And I think Final Fantasy does an amazing job at that. Whilst you just going through the motion, you're going through the motions of the story that has been authored for you. And I think authored story, this idea of like choose your own path all the time, is kind of things are too skewed in favor of that at the moment in video games, and it probably has been for like 10 or 15 years, versus the authored story. Like, what happened to the authored story? Like, do people not like books anymore? Like, what's wrong with expert storytellers telling you a story?
You're not always made to feel as important, are you? I think that might be part of the problem. And in a video game, like, you're the player, you should be the most important thing. I think maybe that's part of it, that you're not made. You in an authored story, you're not the most important bit, and so you're maybe people.
You're in someone else's head rather than your own head, I suppose. But yeah, agency and leveling up, and I think Final Fantasy is a great example of that. It's got the authored story, but Final Fantasy 7, 8, and 9 certainly. And I always go back to, it's hard when you're saying, this is one of the things I had to try to get out of when I was coming up with what makes a great RPG, because you're skewed towards those RPGs that made you love RPGs in the first place. So it's hard not to just let nostalgia just take over and sort of give you this warped view, versus like you're looking back at what you loved rather than what it is actually subjectively, but honestly you like now. But yeah, that sense of progression through leveling up and the materia system in Final Fantasy, and like you were saying in the Gambit system in 12, where you feel really smart because the Gambit, you like Gambit number 12 or whatever that you've put in is suddenly kicked in. It's like, yes, I planned for this. Finally, my best laid plans have come to work. I think that's like all the way back in Final Fantasy 7, that was happening in a similar way to like, oh, this really bad thing's happened to my party, and now I've got this linked materia here that I only use one every 20 fights, but it's come to pass now, and that gives this sense of agency that you don't get in the story. Yeah,
and that which does lead to one of my sort of biggest, most obvious statements, I think, of this podcast episode, is that one of the things I really like, or that's really important to me, or that I think makes a great RPG, is the ability to role play in a role-playing game, which sounds ludicrously obvious, but that manifests, to tie that into what you were just talking about, that manifests in Final Fantasy for me, because although those characters, as you say, the characters are predefined, and the story, you're sure as hell going to get to that next cutscene that cost $5 million to make. Like, you're going to see that cutscene. There's no way that you're making choices that skirt you around that, or that get you away from it. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. But what Final Fantasy does well in other areas, I think, is then give you that agency to have your characters play different roles in combat. And that, it doesn't sound like, it doesn't necessarily sound like much. It's like, oh, well, this person is the tank and this person is the damage dealer and whatever. But it's more than that for me. It is like, I sort of perceive those characters' personalities through how I set them up in combat, possibly because that is really the only way that you do get to sort of role play or express that in the Final Fantasy games. But it is a very strong part of it for me. I really enjoy doing that, and sometimes there's like there might be like a role switch halfway through because you picked up some cool stuff that, for me, it might be like, oh, that fits this character, even though it doesn't fit what they're currently doing. I'm going to respec them, or I'm going to do whatever it is, and because I'm playing this role, it's like, this person, can be kind of silly. Like, oh, this person is particularly good at this job, but they've always wanted to be this thing instead, or the story tells me that this person's meant to be the healer, but no, they're not going to be the healer in my game. They're going to be, something else. They're going to be like this poisonous assassin or something. So I enjoy that side of Final Fantasy, and kind of playing those roles through the systems that it gives you to do it, which in that case is often combat roles. And more broadly, things like the Witcher games, I think are a very good example of that for me, because although I'm very possibly even that it's the sweet spot, I'm not saying The Witcher is the best at doing this, but it does do it very well for me because you get the authored story, and more specifically, you get an authored character, and this is Geralt, and you're told primarily through his interactions with other people and how they react to him. You're told what kind of person he is and what his past is. But then you get to choose, and I guess have your choices matter in that very explicit sense of you do X and Y happens, but also just in conversation. Is Geralt going to be, is he going to lend a sympathetic ear to these people? Is he just going to like brush them off? So you get to do both, and I enjoy that a lot more so that aspect than like in an Elder Scrolls game, because the role playing in that is more for me is, well, what do I want to do, rather than I'm playing a role. Like, it's just a blank cipher. It's like, well, what do I want to go and achieve today, rather than how would my character react to this.
Yeah, so how do you then feel about things like the Souls games, which are blank slate characters? They don't really say anything or really do anything in terms of the story. Mm-hmm. It's the characters around them that give the context and often tell you what to do, or not what to think, but sort of who you are, I suppose. They tell you who you are. But the only real agency in that comes from your weapons and how you level up your the stats and what gear you choose to work. So do you apply the same level of role playing to that? Or is it different because there are no characters to talk to? There is just one character. I don't know.
Well, see, the role-playing in a Souls game works far better for me than, say, the role-playing in a Zelda game. Because in a Souls game, your character doesn't say anything. They don't have conversations. You don't, have long, drawn-out dialogues with people. But that fits the world. In most cases, I think, you are this wretched, possibly undead thing, and you're a vessel in more than one sense of the word. You're a vessel for the player to perform these actions and be this cool fighting combat character, but you're also just a vessel for what's happening in the world as well. And so that I like that. I like I buy into it, and it fits far more for me than Link in the Zelda games, where it just doesn't make sense to me. I don't like, they talk to him as though he's talking back in the vast majority of the early games particularly, and it's never sat well with me, and I've never it's just been like, that's an odd thing. I can't really role play this. So for the Zelda games, that sense of place has to do a lot more work for me than because there isn't really a role playing element. There isn't, or not in the way that I enjoy it anyway. The Souls games work for me. That's not the strongest part of it. I enjoy, again, probably the sense of place, the history of the world. I do think sometimes in those games it's a little bit too obscure for me, because there's stuff that I can watch on YouTube videos that explains the lore of a particular place. I think there's a YouTuber, Vate Video, who does amazing videos on the Souls lore. And even to the point of like, oh, when this boss dies, the shape that they leave behind as they're exploding is these 3 characters put together from this lore. And it's like, it's crazy stuff, but and I find it very interesting, but it's like, it's so obscure that I'm just not going to see any of that in the game. And so it's a bit too far for me, but I appreciate that it's there, but it's like, unless I happen to watch a video about it, I'm not going to know that. And that's a bit too much work for me to work to do in the game to find this stuff out. Fine. Having to go to an external source to sort of get this extra enrichment is a step too far for me. That kind of takes me out of it a bit too much. So yeah, I mean, yeah, role playing, it sounds obvious, but role playing in role-playing games is a big thing for me and can put me off certain games that don't have the ability to do that in some way, shape or form. And it's like the Dragon Quest series. I can appreciate that a lot of those games are very good. I don't get that from them. That's why I think I would probably choose, like, in general, Final Fantasy over Dragon Quest for that reason. It's not as I don't know, I don't get to sort of express myself as much through them. It's more of a story being told.
And then how important, so one of the things I've got here is the sense of progress being important to an RPG game, and it could be it could be any of these things that we've spoken about. It could be narrative progression, it could be exploration progression, moving more on the map, it could be leveling up, it can be finding new gear, whatever, finding new lore. Because I was thinking that a lot of these things that I like don't really apply to some games that are some series, some RPG franchises that I would consider like top tier. Certainly, maybe not. Maybe I wouldn't consider them top tier for me now, but certainly top tier in terms of how they've influenced my thinking about RPGs. And Pokemon is one of them. The early Pokemon games on Game Boy and the early DS games, especially. Not really so into them now, although I'd still do play them, but I think I've just sort of got Pokemon'd out a bit, and they're just kind of pretty similar with each edition now. But still, they've had a huge influence on me, and I think I was trying to think of, okay, what is it that makes those great? Because the writing is, I mean, it's fine, but it's nothing. It's nothing special. Yeah. The characterization is nothing special. The world building is pretty decent, but it's like the same world as largely the same world building elements and techniques that they've always used, so it's kind of sort of worn a bit thin. But I think in that, it's just this general sense of progression is the key thing, and it sounds a bit sort of nebulous and sort of lacking any precision, but I was thinking, like, every single thing you do in the Pokemon game is progress, and I suppose you couldn't in a way say that about every game, but it's always forward progress. It's always progress towards something higher, I suppose, or something quote unquote better, more leveled up in Pokemon. So you're always going along the path to the next higher gym trainer. You're always finding the next Pokemon, which is filling out more numbers on your Pokedex and potentially adding them to your squad. You're leveling up your Pokemon, you're evolving your Pokemon, you're learning new abilities. Like, everything in that game is all about just constantly moving on from where you are now, and knowing that until you get to the end, there's always going to be something to move on to. So that sense of that gives it like a big sense of scale. So I'm wondering how important that is. And I think probably on most of these games that have been mentioned, Final Fantasy, Demon's Souls, The Witcher, Skyrim, Divinity, all of these, they have a massive sense of scale. I think trying to define whether BioShock is a great RPG or not, it has less of that sense of scale because it's comparatively, it's like 1/10 the length of the rest of those games, most of those games. But I suppose that has scale in other ways, a more sort of sensory scale. But yeah, I think for me, certainly a sense of progress, a sense that there's always something bigger or higher to achieve is probably pretty important. Like, if you just had the same abilities and the same things all the time, then I don't know, is that still a great RPG?
Yeah, I think I do know what you mean. I think I don't think it's as important to me. There's an offshoot of that where it's like the options available are something. They don't necessarily need to be sort of onwards and upwards, though. They might be, I've touched on before, like I'm the kind of, I play Hearthstone a reasonable amount. I'm the kind of Hearthstone player that isn't really looking for the most optimal deck or the one that wins or the one that kind of gets the biggest win streak. It's like making those odd things work.
Yeah, but I mean, progress in Hearthstone might be using different cards that you use, not necessarily more powerful ones, but you're progressing in terms of using different cards than you were before.
Yeah. So that would be like, that fits into something like The Witcher, where you might go, and I have done this, gone, looking for a particular set of armor and liking having the cat set of armor, whatever it is, because I like how that fits kind of the Geralt that I'm currently playing on, and even just how it looks. Like, so that armor looks cooler than the bear one or whatever it might be, versus that kind of forward momentum, because that's kind of like, it feels to me like that's sort of sideways. Like, but yes, it's still progress, definitely down a particular track, but it's like a sideways movement rather than an upwards movement.
Yeah,
which,
maybe upwards isn't. I think a spread is probably more accurate. So it doesn't necessarily have to be, because acquiring a new Pokemon doesn't necessarily mean an upgrade.
Sure, it's not necessarily. Yeah. Actually, it occurs to me. It's funny because you talked about Pokemon several months ago, many months ago, in the I Love You But episode that we did, which was games that we've loved in the past but we wouldn't play again. And so you talked about Pokemon in that, and the reason it's funny is because the thing I was thinking of as you were talking about that was Plants vs. Zombies, which was a game that I talked about in that same episode, but specifically the Zen Garden in Plants vs. Zombies, where, I mean, this is as simple as progression gets, but you're watering these things, you check in periodically, you water these plants, they get bigger and bigger and bigger, and then they reach like their final form. But in the meantime, you're also getting other plants, and sometimes, you're filling out your slots basically in your greenhouse, and you'll get ones that are different, and you have to go through different challenges or different things to get these ones. But there's that sense of, a spread. It is like that. It is like it's like, it's not necessarily getting a better one or getting something that is, making the previous things redundant. It's like there's more variety here, and it's broadening it. It's a filling out of a breadth of stuff rather than just a sort of a linear progression from the one thing to a better thing to a better thing. So yeah, I do. That does sort of scratch a particular itch for me, and probably a bigger than I kind of appreciate or identify, but it's not something that I would sort of tacitly acknowledge and think, actually that is important. And I can point to all the games where there is a strong sense of that, and I do enjoy it. But that might be, at a most fundamental level, it might be why historically you have enjoyed the Pokemon games a lot, and I've always kind of bounced off them because I just wasn't looking for that at that moment, and I've never really sort of gone all in on it. So that's, the sense of progression there that you've just chosen, with the sense of place / depth of world, this kind of experiential, nebulous kind of feel of a game. It needs to make me feel a certain way or feel something. What else did you have? You had
narrative consequences.
The consequences,
whether
consequences
you make
to
them
your
or
choices.
not.
Yeah.
Well, not always your choice. Well, consequences for
Just
your choices.
choices.
I do believe in consequences for your choices in terms. I think that's important all the time in leveling up and those sort of things for sure. But narratively, I'm not 100% sure. But then I don't know. Then it's like Divinity 2 is like Divinity Original Sin 2 is one of my favorite RPGs, and if that didn't have choices. Then it wouldn't be one of it. Like, that is such a core part. But then there are other RPGs that I love that don't have it at all. So, one of the problems in making one of these definitively what is the greatest. Like, there's always going to be conflicts, and you're always going to be struggling to have a universal rule for everything. Well, I think it's specifically this genre as well, because this genre is so many things now are considered an RPG that it's hard to. One person's RPG isn't another person's RPG even.
Yeah. Well, so that, just to quickly loop back to the Divinity thing before we wrap up, that's one of those games where absolutely I love the freedom that I feel like I'm afforded. I mean, I'm probably afforded it in every game, but I love the freedom that I feel like I'm afforded, particularly in a multiplayer game. Perhaps that's a key part of it, that I'm role-playing this character. This character would do this thing. This thing is probably suboptimal to our overall progress, and it's probably going to cause some problems. But, it's Fane. That's what Fane would do. Like, I can't help it. That's just what I'm going to do. And that isn't like the wang rod defense, as Matt Colville terms it. That is, I'm going to do deliberately irritating and annoying stuff and just say, oh, that's what my character would do. Because it's still within the confines of the video game. So you can still only make a certain number of choices. But I like that freedom that's afforded to me of, well, I kind of have to just follow what Fane's doing. I think the fact that Divinity 2 is set up in that way that you do... well, hopefully everybody knows by this point, there's kind of like you're part of a party, but ultimately there's only like one chosen one or whatever it's called. I can't remember what it's called now.
The Divine, I think.
The Divine. So like you're working together, but yeah, there's probably going to come a point where you are going to have to make your own choices. So you might as well be true to yourself from the beginning rather than just having the party line.
Well, that's interesting. Yes, I played it in 4-player though, so trying to work that one out. Be true to yourself and not your party, but you need the party to get you to the ends. How do you figure that one out? Yeah, there's your choice and consequences. And the RPG thing, yeah, absolutely. As you said, RPGs mean many different things to many different people. There is possibly there's some merit in us exploring further down the line more specific, more focused sort of subgenres of RPG and talking more about those, because it is a very big topic. But nonetheless, hopefully we have reached some sort of clear delivery of the things that are important to us, at least, to make a great RPG, even if it's not the things that definitively make a great RPG. Yeah. Okay. So I think that's the end. We've nailed what makes a great RPG.
Let us know.
Yeah. If you know, let us know on Twitter. We are at Indie by Design. We're at Indie by Design on all social media platforms. If you go to our Twitter, you'll also find a link to our Discord. And if you go to indiebydesign.net, you'll find a link to all the video game books that we write and produce and publish. And our latest one, 20 Double Fine Years. If you're quick, you can pre-order it now. Shipping will begin very soon on that, which is very exciting for us and for everyone. So yeah, go and check that out if you're interested in our books. But otherwise, thank you for listening, and we will see you again next week.